Welcome to Uptown Chats, a podcast where we share stories about environmental justice by and for everyday people. I'm your co-host, Jaron.
And I'm your other co-host, Lonnie.
And today, we're talking about everybody's favorite topic, trash.
Trash.
We've already covered trash. I know we've already covered other topics like composting and rats, which are definitely related, but we haven't talked about trash or waste specifically here in New York City. But before we get to that, Lonnie, can you read WEACT's mission?
Absolutely. WEACT's mission is to build healthy communities by ensuring that people of color and or low-income residents participate meaningfully in the creation of sound and fair environmental health and protection practices and policies.
Thank you. So now let's get to the fun part. And before we get too far into, talking about what the waste system looks like here in New York City and why it's messed up, let's talk about what we're referring to when we say waste. What is waste? Well, waste is generally just defined as any material, substance, or byproduct that's discarded, no longer wanted, or has served its initial purpose and is therefore deemed unusable or without value. It's kind of a harsh definition. I'm like, when we call people trash, I'm like, wow, this is probably what we're referring to.
It's much deeper than we thought.
I know. It's like hits on a deeper level. But waste can take lots of different forms, and it's categorized based on its source and its composition. You think of more common streams of waste like organics, recyclables, metal, glass, plastic, paper, e-waste or electronic waste, and then textiles, so all the fabric and clothes that get thrown away.
So how does the waste system work here in New York City? So there's like four major components to our waste system, and that's the collection, there's the transfer stations, and sorting, and then there's just like the final disposal. And so with the collection, sanitation workers collect waste from our homes and buildings. There are three main types of streams. So trash and recyclables, that's your metal, glass, plastics, and paper, and cardboard. And then you have like your organics waste, or your food scraps or yard waste. Mm-hmm. That waste is then taken to some type of local transfer station where it's compacted and prepped for transport. And this helps to reduce kind of the volume and make transport to the final destination a little bit more efficient. But some waste goes through a sorting process. So recyclables are sent to material recovery facilities where they're sorted, processed, and prepped to be sold as raw material for new products. And then there's actually your compostable waste. And if we're separating, in which New York City does now have a universal collection for organic waste, it goes to either a composting facility, which is on Staten Island, or it goes to the anaerobic digestion down in Newtown Creek, which we actually recently just talked about that in our biogas episode. Mm-hmm. So, and some people take their organic waste, like their food scraps and their yard waste, to local community composters to create compost for soil amendments. And then finally, everything that else is remaining after you've kind of separated everything out and sorted through everything, the remaining trash, so that's not what's not recyclable or compostable, is transported out of New York City by truck, rail, or barge or ship. And most of it ends up in landfills, mainly in neighboring states, though a small portion of the waste is sent to a waste-to-energy facility for incineration. Often we talk about the one in New Jersey, in Newark, and that facility there.
Which we alluded to. So again, if that sounds familiar, then that means that you were kind enough to listen to one of our previous episodes about waste incineration or about biogas. So thank you. But as Lonnie alluded to, it's somewhat complicated process about, where all this waste goes, depending on what's in there between the time that you put it out on your curb or you put it in a bin and the time that it actually makes it to its final destination, either here in New York City or in a different state. So one thing you might be asking yourself, and really at the heart of this episode today, we'll be talking about why is waste and how is waste an environmental justice concern, with the help of a member of WEACT's Climate Justice Working Group, Julio Lopez Torres, who's been researching and working on this issue for quite a while.
Let's get into it.
My name is Julio Lopez. I am a resident of Hamilton Heights here in West Harlem. I've been in the neighborhood for about 5 years now. I have a master's in environmental policy and sustainability management, which is where my background comes in when it comes to like waste and like renewable energy. My studies were also very focused on like anti-colonial and anti-capitalist practices and how that applies towards building a better, safer environment and how to tackle climate change from that perspective. I lived in Arizona for many years before moving here, and then before that I was in Puerto Rico. So
can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with WEACT? Obviously you're here and you're joining us for this interview. At some point you got plugged in and learned about WEACT. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, no. So I was actually reflecting on this because I moved into his neighborhood about 4 years ago. And I remember one of the first days I was walking around with my wife, I saw the big WEACT banner downstairs, right? I lived 2 blocks down. And I snapped a photo and then I did some research. I was like, oh, wow, like this organization is involved in a lot of things that like I think about often, you know, like a lot of things that I care about, but like I just have never been involved, you know. Like I used to work a corporate job, so I think this country, we have a lot of distractions, you know, like we have a lot of debt, we have a lot of responsibilities, and sometimes we get distracted from like the actual things that matter. So I found out about WEACT and I was like, you know what, like I can definitely dedicate time to like being a member and like doing some work with them. But then COVID hit and literally I moved into this neighborhood like 2 months before COVID started. And kind of like we just like sheltering in place, kind of like forgot about it. Then I decided to go back to school and get my master's. So then I was kind of busy with that, but like I always had WEACT in the back of my mind. Like WEACT was always like an example that was brought up in my studies. I did my master's at the New School. So a lot of my professors are like activists, they're scholar activists, and a lot of our education was grassroots approaches, indigenous approaches to the climate crisis. So WEACT was definitely something that always kept coming up. I was super busy in school, so I couldn't get involved with anything. But then towards my last semester, I started attending some of the membership meetings, and eventually I started joining some of the working groups and getting more involved, and here I am.
Yeah, and Julio's been like a superstar so far with like being involved with like the climate justice working group, for sure.
What sparked your interest in the issue of waste specifically? Is this something that came up during your master's program, or was it something else that kind of triggered this interest in this issue of waste?
Yeah, so I would say that kind of as an individual, I've been aware of like how much waste I produce. I grew up in Puerto Rico and I grew up middle class, so it wasn't like I needed stuff, you know, like, but my family, particularly my grandparents, always instilled this sense of not being wasteful. My grandma, my mom's side of the family, it's so funny because this is something that my cousins like joke about. At night, if one of us will leave a light on, she will run into that room to turn it off, you know? So like sometimes we will be out in the living room and the rest of the house will be pitch dark. And like when you're a kid, yeah, that's kind of scary, you know? But like, it's kind of like that. Like, I don't know if you've seen the memes about like Hispanics and like how we were sustainable before like sustainability became like a trendy. And it's like you will go into like open up a fridge and like grab a tub of butter and there will be like white rice in there. So that's kind of like how I grew up, you know, and just being mindful. And then I think that kind of like what sparked my interest was like going from Puerto Rico and then Arizona, where like everything's new for the most part. Like the infrastructure is new, like sanitation, like waste management is very efficient. You know, you don't see trash on the street. Trash pickup is like a truck that just comes around the neighborhood and picks up the bin on its own and like dumps the trash in the back, like in most American cities, you know, and like other places. And then I moved here. I felt like I took like 20 steps back, you know. It's like there's trash everywhere. Like pickup is like 4 guys walking behind a truck, grabbing trash bags from the sidewalk and throwing them on the back of a truck, which is like how trash collection is done in Puerto Rico. And it's like this city has so much money, and like how are we so behind on something that is so essential, you know? And like you're walking around the street and you're dodging like human and dog feces, right? You're dodging rats everywhere. Like I saw probably one rodent my whole, like my 18 years living in Arizona, you know? And then from there, it was something that was kind of like in the back of my mind and like bothering me. And I was like, we could definitely do this better. So then when I applied for grad school, I had to write an admissions paper, and I was like, damn, I haven't written anything in like 10 years. Like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. So then I decided to just do a research paper on like the history of like the lack of waste management practices in New York City. And then from there, I was like, whoa, this makes a lot of sense. And yeah, and then funny enough, like when I was in school, I didn't actually focus that much on waste. I focused a lot more on like Puerto Rico's colonial relationship with the United States and how that has impacted food and energy security. But yeah, waste was something that I always kind of like read about, and like professors always like gave us a wide array of subjects to read on any given week, and I would just like kind of like pick and choose, and if there was anything on waste, I would read it. But yeah, now after school, I'm decided to get a little bit more involved and join the zero waste working group with Lonnie. So
shout out to
yeah,
a little promotion for a little promo there. Yeah. I always find it fascinating that kind of thinking about how we grow up and just kind of throughout life, waste is kind of like an afterthought. We don't think about it as something as intricate it is. Once you start getting to school and you start doing research and learning how intricate it is, whether it be the systems, the different types of waste, where the waste goes, how we're producing waste. Like there's so many aspects to it. When you're just a kid and you learn your first song about recycling, I won't sing it, but that's kind of like your extent of like understanding waste and sustainability and what that means. It's like, oh, separate your plastics, your cans, and your paper. But given all of kind of like your research and kind of your expertise in waste, can you give us like kind of almost like a little bit of a historical overview of like waste management in the city and in general?
You can pull from that paper. I don't know if you still have it with you.
Yeah, no, I pulled stuff from the paper when I was preparing for this, just to refresh my memory. And then there's also a really good New York Times article that came out recently that talks about it. So I'll touch up on a few different things, but unsurprisingly, like not a lot has changed since like the colonizers first settled in Manhattan. Like back then, it was a lot of organic waste that they would just throw over those city walls or like throw them in the waterways or like the swamps, and then eventually like those became landfills. But there's a lot of parts of Manhattan that are actual like trash landfills, and that's how they expanded parts of the city. I think like Roosevelt Island is one of them, if I'm not mistaken. Ellis Island definitely used to be a lot smaller. I think like large portions of the Upper West Side were also like filled in. Battery Park, of course. Wow. Even like waste has shaped the size and like the shape of Manhattan,
New York
throughout
City,
history.
Built by trash.
Yeah, definitely built by trash.
That sounds like a New Jersey slogan.
I'm not for New Jersey. Don't worry. I'm not a plant.
No, but I mean, funny that we bring up New Jersey, because back in the 30s and before that, New York City used to just dump trash in the Atlantic. And then Jersey got tired of it and sued New York City, took us to federal court. And then that's when New York City stopped dumping trash in the Atlantic because of that. So it's always been kind of like a out of sight, out of mind mentality when it comes to like waste in New York City. In the 1800s, there were like thousands of pigs that roamed the city, and they would just eat off like any organic scrap. I guess like back in the day, people were really selective about the cuts of meats that they wanted. So butcher shops would just throw whatever was left over out on the sidewalks. People would just throw out like remains of like fish and like other food discards, and these pigs would just like clean it up.
It sounds horrible.
Yeah. So
it's like food hell.
Yeah. And it's like, what about like diseases from these pigs or like their feces? Like I think like they used to like, their pens were like somewhere were like around Central Park. So like at night, these pigs would just like on their own just go back home basically. Wow. And then when Central Park opened, they basically got evicted, and then we got rid of the pigs. But yeah, so that's just like New York City. It just hasn't known how to handle trash. And as I brought up that article of New York Times because they have photos from like the 1910s and like 1920s and 1970s, and trash on the sidewalk is basically the same as it is now as it was before. Trash collection was the same, right? Like now it's guys walking behind trucks. Back in the day, it was like guys walking behind like horse-drawn carriages, right? And they were just dumping trash in the back of a truck. Another thing is that property owners are the ones responsible for maintaining the sidewalks clean, right? So like whether that's a residential or commercial building, it's up to them to clean it, right? So like some do a better job than others. So that's why you don't see a lot of street sweepers in New York City. You don't see people like picking up trash. It's because it's the responsibility of the property owner, even if it wasn't their fault. You know, like I could walk in front of a building and just dump all my trash and walk away, and like it's that property owner that has to clean it up. So it's also kind of like created this culture of like littering. People just throw trash on the ground, like they don't care. Yeah, somebody else is gonna pick it up. And if we're talking about littering and waste on the streets, there's a huge discrepancy between affluent neighborhoods and communities like Harlem, right? Like the amount of like trash bins in the corners is way higher in the Upper East Side than it is in East Harlem.
And I think we've touched on that idea a little bit. This idea of, I think it parallels a lot of the other, inequities that we see around the presence of rats and other issues. But
it wasn't always bad. There was actually like a brief period in 1895 after Colonel George E. Waring Jr. was appointed as the head of the Department of Street Cleaning. This guy was a Civil War veteran, and he ran this like the street cleaning department like a military, like with military precision. He like he was actually the first one to separate the collection of organic waste from like actual refuse and ash. So essentially, like he started like one of the first recycling programs in the whole nation. He unfortunately passed away a couple years later, and then even though the city kept up with the program, once the U.S. or once the First World War started and the Federal Reclamation Act went into place, basically like the military was in charge of collecting all waste so that if it could be used in the war effort, it could be used for like weapons or bomb manufacturing or whatever. The city got used to not paying for trash collection during that period, right? And like we know how corrupt like New York politicians, right? So like they were probably lining their pockets during these years. And then once the war ended and the city had to like become responsible again for trash collection, they were like, no, we're not gonna be going back to like what we were doing, throw everything in the same bin and then we'll just collect it. And then recycling didn't come back until like the 80s. We still really don't have compost, but we did have it back then. So it can be done, but we just need to have the political will to do it.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of ups and downs historically with just how we handle waste in the city. It's actually interesting to hear how early separation of waste took place, because now we're thinking about it as such a modern issue of like how are we separating recycling versus organic waste and what are we doing with it. But it seems like this has been thought about before. It's not new. You talked a little bit about kind of funding aspects to it. So how does kind of poor funding impact our waste management?
Yeah, so it's impacted in different ways. Back in the 70s or before the 70s, the city was responsible for collecting both residential and commercial trash. But that's when the city was going through like a financial like recession. So then that's when they decided to make commercial buildings responsible for their own trash collection. That's where we had like the proliferation of like private trash carters and kind of like how the mafia got into it. Like if you watch The Sopranos and you're like, how is Tony in waste management? It's because of that, right? But at the moment as it stands, the city is in charge of residential trash collection free of charge. Obviously it comes from like our taxes, but unlike other cities where they actually charge individuals, like for example, when I lived in Arizona, like I paid for trash collection monthly, so like you don't have that here. So it's also like a budgeting issue. It's like the amount of waste that is produced in this city, and there's something like over 800,000 residential buildings in New York City. So yeah, it's a huge mountain to climb. So if you're not properly funding these systems, then you have a situation like we had back in after World War I, where the city was like, the cheapest option is to just dump everything in the same bin and then do away with it, right? Poor funding as well, as we mentioned before. It's like little funding goes into black and brown neighborhoods, so there's less trash bins in the corners, right? So collection is less frequently, so that's why you have more trash on the street. And you have an education aspect, right? Like the city doesn't do a good job of educating the citizens on proper waste disposal, right? Like I remember, I think last year when the city came up with the great idea of like pushing back collection time because they thought that was going to help with rats. All they did was like put flyers in people's like mailbox, and it didn't really explain anything. And it's like the rats are there, like 24/7. It doesn't matter when you move, like when you put the trash out or not, like they're gonna know it's there, so
I feel like we kind of touched on this in a lot of your response to some of the previous questions, but we always like to put a fine point on it. How do you view waste management as an environmental justice issue, and how does that fit into some of the issues around access, equity, and all of that?
Yeah, no, waste is a huge environmental justice issue. I mean, even just in the context of our live environment in black and brown neighborhoods where you see trash everywhere, you see like feces on the ground, you see like food waste, you see rats, pests that carry diseases and get people sick. But like even just like seeing trash on the ground has a huge mental health issue. Like I've loved my time in New York City, but then I've also come to recognize that like I've had some mental health issues because of this environment, because of sometimes how loud it is, like the ambulances that like go by all the time, the trash everywhere. Like sometimes I walk by trash and I just like get so angry, It's like you grow up like this, like it affects your like mental health. And then when it comes to New York City specifically, right, like we don't have any landfills in the city anymore. There's no incinerators like there used to be back in the day. Like back in before the 80s, there were something like 22 municipal incinerators, but then there was something like 17,000 incinerators inside residential buildings.
Wow.
Yeah, but then what's funny about that is that like we can look at it and be like, oh, that's a terrible idea, right? Like you're putting out all these like microplastics and all these like all this like methane out into the atmosphere, but like burning waste is seen as a green solution now. It's being sold as a green alternative. Like a lot of our organic waste gets shipped off to other states where it's burned in incinerators, right? And like all of this organic waste is being labeled as unfracked natural gas. It's basically our garbage is being used to produce electricity like it used to be back in the day, after advocates fought against it. And then on the issue of our waste going to other communities, right? Like our waste basically goes to transfer stations primarily located in black and brown neighborhoods in the city. And then that goes off upstate. It goes to New Jersey, right? Like there's a huge incinerator in the Ironbound community. And I know from my time in the program, I know a lot of people that work in New Jersey, and they oppose the Covanta incinerators. So it's like our waste, like the amount of waste that New Yorkers produce, it's massively overburdening black and brown communities all over the Northeast. Like we ship off our trash out to Cleveland at times,
Yeah.
So it's like wild. So it's like we're putting the burden of our waste on other communities.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that because two things. One, the issue of waste and waste management inherently linked to the formation of WEACT. We've talked about that before. It's very, very core to like why WEACT exists. But also, in one of our previous interviews with Peggy Shepard, who helped create WEACT, that's one of the things that she mentioned is like has been a persistent issue for the city is this issue of waste management, especially as it relates to environmental justice. So clearly it's for whatever reason, the city just can't figure it out. It's been struggling with it.
I think that's also a really good segue into this idea of like, we know all this, we have all this knowledge, we know that things are wrong, we can't bulldoze the city, and we can't burn it down. We're not advocating for that.
We're not doing that.
Don't get crazy.
To build alleyways. What are we supposed to do? Like, what's the current state? And, given the infrastructure that we have that is old, we're an old city. There's only so much that we can do to manipulate the actual infrastructure itself. What are some of the things that we can do kind of given this current state of waste management? What are some like upcoming, whether it be public or private initiatives or solutions that people should know about or we should be thinking about?
Yeah. So in the context of climate change, right? Because all of these issues are interconnected, right? Like our waste and increasing like temperatures connected, right? Like all of our food waste produces a lot of methane, which is like 80 times more efficient at trapping heat than CO2, right? So like diverting as much organic waste from our landfills has to be a priority, and then you do that through like composting programs. Here in the city, there's a lot of community organizations that have been implementing composting programs, educating their communities. You have BK Rot, Harlem Grown, all of these organizations that have these programs, but with proper funding, like they could help a lot. You have the city should be rolling out curbside composting by the end of the year. Not sure where that's at or like any update. That should help, even though majority of the city composting goes into a chemical, basically like where it's like turned into fuel, right? Like it gets turned into like methane for energy generation, which I would rather see organic waste be turned into compost that could be used as fertilizer, and like replenish a lot of our soils, or be used at community gardens, or be sold to like farmers upstate or whatever, instead of it just being burnt. The city is piloting like waste containers, right? For like smaller buildings, they're piloting like those like black wheelie bins that you roll out to the curb. They have like these fancy new trucks with arms that like everybody else has had for decades, but they're new in New York City.
It's exciting.
It's exciting. Yeah. I think it was like even they made fun of themselves, the sanitation department. They said this is our lunar landing when they like
That's hilarious.
Yeah, when they like revealed the truck with the arm. And then you have like the bigger container bins for bigger buildings, or just to be shared, right? Like the ones in front of my building are used by the buildings like around me. So that's a huge start. I think that getting plastic bags off the sidewalks is a must, right? Like, it's gross, man. Like when you're walking around the city and it's trash day, like. And you're having to dodge rats that are just feasting on these trash. It's not a good look for the city either. It's like the city receives so many tourists, and it's like, and it's so backwards, in my mind. Yeah, so like that should be a big step towards it. Obviously, like there's pros and cons. Like I mentioned, I see less rats. It feels a little bit cleaner, but then also there's some cons, right? Like there's business owners around my block that they haul their trash to our bins instead of paying for trash collection now, right? So then those bins are overflowing, so there's still trash on the sides or like next to them. Also, like the way that they're piloting it out is like they have these bins that are chained up, right? And then they have to be unhooked and then rolled out by people, and then picked up into a trash truck, which takes forever, right? Like these people are on any given block for like at least 30 minutes, which impacts traffic, and then the people are honking, and so definitely like I'm a big fan of them, but it needs some work. But I'm gonna say I have confidence in the city that they're gonna figure it out, because I think they need to. It's a priority, and I think like New Yorkers need to rally around this. It's kind of baffling that people are okay, with having so much waste on our street, And yeah, the city, like, they've been trying to establish all these rules for like separating waste for like commercial buildings, and then also like schools and NYCHA buildings and government agencies. Not sure how well that's being handled, but like the city's at least trying to divert waste. You also have a lot of startups that are coming into the mix. Startups, obviously, like, they're for profit, so take what they do with a grain of salt. But I mean, at least there's more people trying to help with this issue. But I think the main thing that needs to happen in this city and like in the United States in general, it's a cultural shift. Like, we're such a materialistic society. Like, we consume so much stuff that's unnecessary, and it just ends up on the streets or on a landfill or like on an incinerator, or overburdening a black and brown community and outside of the city, or even like overseas, right? Like, up until a couple years ago, the United States used to send most of its plastic waste to Asia, and like China, and they stopped taking it, and like, it's not like it's getting recycled there, it's just getting piled up, so I think it's a switch in a mindset. It's like, do I really need this? Do I really need to buy everything brand new? And it's not to put the responsibility on the consumer, because I also think that like corporations have 90% of blame here. Like, they're the ones that are pushing these products on us. They're the ones that are like developing these needs for their products. So there definitely needs to be more accountability in corporations. I think we need to push our legislators to hold these corporations accountable for the waste that they produce, right? Like, especially when it comes to like single-use plastic, like these corporations, they'll sell as anything,
Absolutely.
You're saying?
Yeah. Well, on that note, and thinking about the multifaceted approach, all the things that need to be done, Lonnie, how can folks get involved with this kind of work? We have a perfect example here, but do you want to say more?
Glad you all asked. So WeAct has a climate justice working group who has a subcommittee that is working on zero waste and really focusing right now on educating the public, mostly Northern Manhattan, on basically kind of giving people sometimes their first introduction to waste at all. I know so many people in my building who have no idea how to separate their waste, or they don't separate it at all. And there's no way of, mitigating that without just properly educating people and getting it being a part of their everyday routine and lifestyle. So that's something that we definitely going to be working on. And we are, as an organization that also does a lot of policy work, so we're always working and looking at legislation at the city and state and federal levels that relate to waste as well, and doing the advocacy around that. So you can definitely get involved by joining the Climate Justice Working Group.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe one day you'll end up on the podcast because of that.
Yeah, like me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're interested in the issue of waste and you want to get more involved, that Zero Waste Subcommittee is a great launching pad to jump into that and get started. So we'll make sure to include information in the show notes for how to join. You can check it out. Thanks for listening. If you're at this point feeling that you want to be able to take some action in your personal life on how can you help reduce your contributions to waste in New York City, how can you help reduce the amount of waste that you generate and minimize your impact on environmental justice communities? Well, we have been so kind enough to include a guide on how you can move towards a zero waste lifestyle. And there's some really good recommendations in there to help reduce the amount of waste that you generate and reduce the impact on communities. So we'll make sure to include a link in the show notes for you to check that out. There's a 3-step simple guide for you to explore and take some actions. If you like this episode, make sure to rate and review the show on whatever platform you listen on. And if you have thoughts about the show, we encourage you to reach out to us with your thoughts and suggestions at podcast@weact.org.
You can also check out WeAct on Facebook at WeAct for EJ. That's WeActForEJ. On Instagram, X, and YouTube at WeAct for EJ. That's WeAct4EJ. And check out our website, weact.org, for more information about environmental justice.
Until next time.
Bye.
Don't be trashy.
Don't be trashy. Don't be trashy.
Don't be trashy.